Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. In the previous lecture, we looked at some of the kinds of deviation which the poets and the literary artists employ in order to make their writing distinct, unique and unusual. And this is one of the ways that foregrounding can be achieved in any writing. And for the sake of creating foregrounding, a writer or a poet may choose any of the forms of deviations that are available either at semantic level, morphological level, graphological level, or historical level. In our last lecture, we had a detailed look at 4 kinds of deviation, and we tried to analyze what is meant by each kind of deviation and what are the effects of these deviations upon the reader, and how does a reader encounter these deviations. We looked at all these kinds with reference to a few examples from poetry in order to judge that if as a reader we encounter a deviation either in the form of phonological deviation, graphological deviation or semantic deviation, what effect would it produce on our understanding of the meaning, our comprehension of the ideas, and how would it affect us emotionally or aesthetically. Since deviations are known to prolong the moment or the experience of comprehension, and apart from that they also involve an exercise on part of the reader that involves interpretation. So what sort of interpretation and the skills of interpretations are employed by the reader when he encounters deviation? And also, when deviation occurs in a text, it is something that is deliberate and not random, because a poet has a particular design or reason for making use of a deviant idea or phrase. So this deviation produces effect of surprise as well as of interest for the reader. Since deviations are irregularities which are encountered by the reader in a text, and the reader judges it against something that is correct, regular, or you can say conventional. When an unconventional, deviant, irregular way of expression, either grammatical expression or semantic expression, is encountered by a reader in a literary writing, the first thing that he does is that he would judge it against the norm. He would judge it against the standard use of language. And while measuring it with the standard use of language, he would come across the deviation or the violation, that is how much a writer violates or breaks the rule. And in breaking of the rule, what surprising feeling or what surprising effect does this deviation have on the reader is most significant part, because the apparently illogical and of course a bit incorrect expression carries meaning within or at the deeper level, and the reader is enchanted or is impressed by the way the writer has imagined something in a unique way which he had never imagined before. So in the study of the types of deviation, we firstly had a look at phonological deviation, which means that any deviation that occurs at the level of the sounds, not meaning. Phonological deviation deals with the repetition of sounds or the abnormality in expression in forms of sound. For example, the way pronunciations would vary or deviate, the way assonance, consonance or alliteration would create a repetitive pattern within a poem. We also had a look at lexical deviation, in which word formation, laws and rules are broken and certain words are created by mixing or joining 2 words together, taking parts of each word. And it also includes neologism or coining of new words, either for the sake of creating a humorous impact in the writing or poem, or either for the sake of giving a novel idea to the reader. So the writer's skill lies in mastery of creating a new word, coining a new word, or making a suitable word or creating a suitable expression by combining 2 existing words. That would be the lexical deviation, where the rules of lexis or word formation are broken. We had a look at the grammatical deviation as well, where we started from the trivial grammatical deviation, that is just the breaking of the rules of grammar in the form of verb forms or the tense use, which would reveal the writer's ability to render reality if the speaker is conveyed to be a non-native speaker of the language, or in our case, English. Then grammatical deviations also relate to such instances where the writer has deliberately employed it in order to create a sense of distortion in the society or in the world through the distortion of the pattern of grammar in language and writing. The graphological deviation, which also is referred to as orthographic deviation, which deals with the script, the writing or the appearance of the text. It includes within it any deviant use of punctuation, either sticking too closely to punctuation or ignoring the laws of punctuation. Graphological or orthographic deviation also includes emphasis on capitalization or ignoring capitalization, and we have seen that with reference to two famous poets, American poets, Emily Dickinson and E.E. Cummings. One sticks to the use of capitalization and the other completely ignores it. Today we will deal with the rest of the four types of deviation, which are semantic deviation, dialectical deviation, deviation of register, and historical deviation. Now, let us have a look first at the semantic deviation, that is the fifth type of deviation. As the very name suggests, that semantic deviation would deal with meaning, as semantics is the branch of linguistics that deals with the study of meaning. Now, about the importance of meaning in poetry and the distortion of meaning in poetry with the use of metaphors, puns, or conceits or euphemisms, we have seen that writers convey multiple messages or meanings to the reader. W.B. Yeats thought that an element of irrationality is always present in great poetry. So this comment by W.B. Yeats clarifies that anything that is deviant, that would be revealing the irrationality or the element of irrationality in poetry, and that he terms as an essential part of poetic expression. If poetic expression too would stick to the logical, coherent and rational order or expression, it would not have any difference from the ordinary or everyday speech and writing. So this element of irrationality that is created with the use of semantic deviation has been considered a very vital and significant part of poetic expression, and that is how foregrounding can be achieved in writing. There is a sophisticated loneliness that is encompassed within a semantic deviation or the use of symbols or metaphors, and that is remarked by Theodore Rothe. He states that the element of irrational is something that is sophisticated silliness. A sophisticated silliness means that on the surface level you would find the expression as unbelievable and irrational and something that cannot be justified. For example, observe this example and try to understand that why these critics like Yeats and Theodore Rothe have commented that element of irrationality and sort of nonsensical sense or loneliness is there in semantic deviation or poetry that makes use of semantic deviations. For example, if a poet makes use of a paradox, like John Donne in his Holy Sonnet in Death Be Not Proud says, "Death, thou shalt die." Now here, this expression, "Death, thou shalt die," seems nonsensical because death itself is an agent that brings about the end or the cessation of life. How can it be said that death would itself die? Doesn't it appear irrational, unbelievable, or sort of nonsensical, because something that kills us is referred to the poet as something that would be killed, that would itself die, its own death. Now, apparently this expression, that is a paradoxical expression, conveys irrational idea, unbelievable idea, or untrue idea. But on a closer understanding of this deviation, our reader reaches to the finding of the conclusion that the poet has made a logical point by stating that death would die. Now, in the whole scheme of the poem, when you read the whole holy sonnet of Donne, that is Death Be Not Proud, you find that he has claimed that when he will be reborn in the afterlife, he will leave death behind, and this would be the defeat of death, hence death of death. Now, when the poet or the persona will be reborn, he will be leaving death behind or killing death. His new life would be death of death. So look how this irrational expression that apparently did not seem to convey an authentic or true idea makes sense at the deeper level. So this is how the element of irrationality that is apparently found in any deviation, or specifically the deviation that is referred to as a semantic deviation, can be justified at a more broader or deeper level. These critics like Yeats and Theodore recognize this irrationality as the main characteristic of poetry. And this is the characteristic of poetry we have under focus when we consider the topic of semantic deviation. And in poetry, we transfer meaning from literal perspective to metaphoric perspective. Now, in analyzing this very statement, that was a paradoxical statement, that death thou shalt die, we did not believe in the literal meaning, that how can death die? Because death itself is something that leads to others' death. Now, this was literal perspective which did not make any sense, which appeared incorrect or unbelievable. But when we transfer meaning into figurative perspective, looking at it from the angle of the persona who has imagined himself defeating death and hence letting death die, we see that the figurative perspective makes the remark or the statement sensible, believable, and true. So, one problem with semantic deviation is that those who are not well conversant with the understanding of deviations, or with the understanding of the complicated nature of the language of poetry, they may not be able to understand the deeper or the figurative meaning. And if we take semantic deviation literally, we may not be able to translate the real meaning, and it would appear absurd and nonsensical to us if we go for the literal meaning of the word. So, semantic deviation operates at the level of meaning. It may employ figures like metaphor, symbols, images, and puns, irony, where meaning is inverted. So, when a semantic deviation operates at the level of meaning, and that not only is literal meaning but the connotative meaning, that is the connotation of the word being used is transferred to figurative or symbolic perspective. This is where the interpretation of the semantic deviation would make sense, or it would appear believable. Consider these few more examples taken from the poetry that you are well conversant with. One is from Wordsworth's poem, that is the expression where he says, "The child is the father of the man." Now this expression again seems absurd, unbelievable. We know that child is the offspring of a man. How can he be father of a man? Now this statement, if taken literally, would lose its charm, its beauty, its authenticity, or its value as a piece of literature or as a piece of art. Now, look at the very thing that the face value oddity lends it abnormal power, and this power and significance is granted to the expression when you transfer the meaning from literal to the metaphoric perspective. Whereas by deliberately unimaginative standards of interpretation, it is impossible for a child to be the father of a man. So in the way where we look at language as denotative meaning only, the dictionary meaning only, we would render this statement as incorrect. We may regard this statement as untrue, but the semantic value of Wordsworth's dictum or statement forces the reader that we have to look beyond the dictionary meaning of the word, and father cannot be just the progenitor of the child, but the child himself can function as somebody from whom the father can learn. So if child is the father of man, it reveals that the child has the wisdom, the child has the innocence, the child has the beauty, which would lend sort of knowledge or understanding to a grown-up man that would make him the father of the man. So in this way, see that this expression, which just like Donne's expression, death, thou shalt die, at literal perspective appeared to be nonsensical and absurd, gains its value at semantic level, at the level of meaning, at the level of you can say metaphoric meaning. That is its deviation from the norms that has made it possible for the poet to expose those ideas which would have been very difficult to express in maybe expression of language, which would have taken longer and detailed descriptions. But here you see that in just a single line, with the use of a single metaphor or a symbol or a conceit, the poet has given expression to a whole lot of philosophy. The child is the father of man conveys the philosophy that how and what a man can learn from children. And that expression by Donne, death, thou shalt die, also encompassed a whole lot of philosophy that how death can be defeated is not something to be feared by. So this is the power of semantic deviation, that it enhances the meaning, it expands the breadth of the message, of the thought and the expression that the poet has conveyed. And one of the most important features of semantic deviation is that so much is compressed within a single expression, either a phrase or a word. Here too, you can see that a single statement, father is the, child is the father of man, and death thou shalt die. These expressions are very compressed. They are easy to be remembered. They become memorable because not only because of their concreteness as well as their compactness, but also for the very reason that they have a very wise saying or a kind of expression of wisdom within them. Another example of semantic deviation that is also perplexing on the surface or seems unbelievable on the surface, but at the deeper level, at the level of meaning or figurative perspective, it conveys a whole lot of meaning. It is from Keats's poem that very celebrated lines, beauty is truth, truth, beauty. Now this expression makes us really wonder that how can beauty be truth and truth be beauty? How can these two ideas or abstract qualities be taken as the same? For example, if we call somebody beautiful, we would not call the same person to be truthful. If beauty is truth, then this other statement of about the person should also be correctly applicable to that human being. So Keats's statement, beauty is truth, truth beauty, is also an example of semantic deviation, where meaning is transported or transferred from literal perspective to figurative perspective. It equates two philosophically important abstractions, and these abstractions are different, truth and beauty. Here Keats is proposing some sort of a mystical unity of the concepts. The concept of beauty and concept of truth are united in their expression, and these expressions we know are treated by us or regarded by us as distinctly different or separate. For example, when we say that we read a story, we say about that story that it is beautiful. So, if a story is beautiful, at the same time, we may not say that it is also true. Now, if there is a contradiction that one thing that is beautiful cannot be true at the same time, makes us really wonder how can Keats use the word beauty for expression of something that is truth and the same for even the truth. So, if he has rendered the quality of beauty and truth as the same, that these can be replaced, he means to refer to the figurative perspective of these two abstractions or important qualities or philosophies. So he means to refer to the fact that beauty is everlasting, beauty is something that everyone would adhere to or praise, and truth too is as beautiful as any expression of beauty is. So the qualities rendered to both these concepts, beauty and truth, are equated at the figurative or at the metaphorical perspective. So in semantic deviation, we have seen that the writers may present certain philosophy or thought or profounder idea which apparently would appear to be nonsensical, unbelievable, or even perplexing. In poetry, transference of meaning or metaphor in its widest sense is the process whereby literal absurdity leads the mind to comprehension on a figurative plane. So what is more important in the semantic deviation is to understand that there will be transference of meaning or the use of a metaphor. So metaphor is one of the figures or devices of comparison which really helps the poets to transfer the meaning. So meaning is transferred. The meaning of beauty is transferred to the meaning of truth, and truth's meaning is transferred to beauty simultaneously. So according to Jeffrey Leach, this is very important concept in poetry, because poets and critics alike have rendered the existence and the use and significance of semantic deviation as a sort of life and blood for poetry. So Jeffrey Leach and other critics consider semantic deviation, which includes the use of metaphors and such conceits and comparative devices, as the vital significant element of any poetry. Even some critics go to the extent of saying that it's not possible to compose poetry without the use of semantic deviation. If figurative perspective is not rendered in poetry, they do not consider it to be worthy of given the status of poetry or artful expression of literature. Hence, the semantic deviation, which includes the use of metaphor, or also it can also use other devices such as devices of comparison, like you can use many symbols which may replace one thing for another. So these are all considered central aspects of poetic expression, and without it, poetic expression may not get its force or it may not get its depth. Hence, the most significant way of producing foregrounding in literature is through the deviation of semantic or meaning. So if a deviation occurs at semantic level, this is the most prominent and you can say artful or aesthetic sort of foregrounding or deviation. Now we move to the second type of deviation, that is referred to as dialectical deviation. Now, in the last deviation, we have seen that the violation occurs at the level of meaning. A poet may choose to replace a word that is appropriately or conventionally employed for an expression that disrupts the imagination or the belief or the knowledge of the reader. It plays with it, it challenges it, because he is transporting one idea from one place to another. Now in this next type of deviation, that is dialectical deviation, an author makes use of expression or styles of language. It may not deal with meaning. Again, I was making a distinction for you people earlier on when we started with the study of types of deviation, that phonological deviation operates at the level of sound, and lexical deviation operates at the level of meaning because it's mixing and joining of words, and semantic deviation also deals with meaning, whereas the graphological deviation, like the phonological deviation, operates at the level of word formation and its structure and appearance. Similarly, dialectical deviation also deals with the mixing of the dialects or styles. So dialectism, or the borrowing of the features of socially or regionally defined languages, is a minor or a trivial form of poetic license or deviation that is not generally available to average writers. Mostly the writers who write prose or who are writing the sort of a serious writing may not make use of the dialectical deviation, because they want to convey the idea more clearly, forcefully and directly to the reader, so they would like to use the same dialect or expression which the reader or the majority of the community is familiar with. But the writers of, for example, humorous fiction or humorous anecdotes or essays and stories, and also the storytellers or fiction writers or novelists are more prone to using the dialectical deviation, because dialectical deviation is mixing some expressions, sentences or statements of some other dialect into a standard dialect or expression. So in that case, it would be mixing, or it would be infusing a writing that is conventional and standard with certain elements or ideas that may not be certain conventional or you can say more popular ways of expression or speech of language. So dialectical deviation is mostly used by the humorists or the storytellers, because they have room to experiment and expand or make use of imagination, even entertain the readers, whereas prose writers mostly focus on conveying ideas and giving knowledge. Their focus is not on storytelling or creating humor primarily. Dialectical deviation makes us aware of the fact that how the dialects or the styles of expression of different kinds of people living or belonging to different regions might be employed within a text. For example, you might have read if the novel by Thomas Hardy, Tess of D'Urbervilles, or even The Return of the Native. Here in these two novels, Thomas Hardy creates a very distinct and unique flavor in his novel by mixing the dialects of the countryside region of England into standard or the more acceptable dialect of English. The characters who are rustic or the characters who belong to countryside or the village, when they are given representation, dialogues or conversation in the novel, they speak in a dialect that reflects their rustic upbringing and their standard of life, which is of course different or deviant from the people living in the city of London, for example. So the change of dialect reveals that a person speaking in the text or being given representation in the text belongs to a particular region or place. Hence, he is using the same dialect. So apart from that example, which I have just quoted for you from Thomas Hardy's novel Tess of D'Urberville and Return of the Native, the particular dialect of the town that he's created as the Wessex County that he creates in his novel as the setting of the story is dominant. As those characters who are more educated and belong to the city, they speak the standard English, and that is what the script of the novel also follows. Whereas when certain characters, parents who belong to the countryside or the rustic life, they are given a voice, that expression or their utterances would be in a very formal dialect that is the dialect of the region Wessex that he has created in the fictional narrative. Another example can be Spenser's Shepherd's Calendar. Spenser, a 16th century poet, has created in his writing a sort of vision or that brings to mind. Spenser, in his celebrated work Shepherd's Calendar, makes use of a dialect that reveals a provincial, homely and rustic setting. It gives representation to those characters or people, giving the glimpses of the life of the countryside through the mixing or infusing of the dialect of those rustic countryside regions. So there are a number of words which Spenser in his poem Shepherd's Calendar has used. For example, the words like Heidegger's, which is a type of dance, a provincial dance, or a very traditional dance of the far off villages of England. Then the word Rontes, which is a reference to young calves or the young bullocks, and then the word venal, which refers to a newly weaned kid or a lamb, and the word wimble, which is now used as word nimble. All these words which no longer belong to the standard dialect of English that we are familiar with, or the standard English dialect that the Londoners or the rest of the people of England are familiar with, when they occur in a text, they evoke a flavor of rustic naivety, simplicity. They're being primitive in a sense that they are far removed from the artificiality of the life of the city, and it is in keeping with the sentiments of the pastoral life, because the poem itself, Shepherd's Calendar, is a pastoral poem that deals with the life of the people of the countryside. So the dialect can be identified through the diction or the words which belong to the particular place or region. And this expression might even lead to the grammatical changes or inaccuracy in expression, which the characters who speak or who are inhabited in the place where they are given a representation in the drama or a poem, these can be picked up from their writing, and a reader can judge that how a particular place or region has been given a representation through the use of a dialectical deviation. Dialecticism is also inseparable from the writer's plan of depiction of the life as it is seen through the experience and the ethos of one particular section of English-speaking society. Now, the writer who has imagined a situation, a setting, a time, a place, or people, he would try to render that in the form of a reality, even in fiction. So if a writer is conveying to you a sense of time, place, belongingness of people, it is quite justified that he would make use of such language which the people of that region or place speak. So if, for example, you are watching a play and you come across certain characters within the play who belong to an upper class or a higher class, or who are either landlords or industrialists or educated class, you will notice in their speech use of words or language which would reveal their class or status. But if within that group of representatives of either the upper class or the affluent class, you come across certain other characters in the play who are, for example, servants, and if those servants seem to speak the same dialect, the same language, or using the same accent or the same vocabulary, you would be surprised that how the lower class or the servants are given a representation in an artificial way. You would not believe in the authenticity of those characters who appear as servants in a play, because you would feel that this servant is speaking language as beautifully or as perfectly, or it is similar to that language which his lord or which his master is speaking. So if you come across people of the lower class, you see that there are certain deviations, there are certain changes or differences in their speech and style. Even their vocabulary or their expression and structure differs from that of yours. So this is what the writers also wish to achieve in their poems or in their plays or fiction. When they make use of dialectical deviation, the main purpose of their writing is that they wish to communicate the sense of accuracy, and they want to render reality as it is perceived rather than creating it artificially in the language that they know or in the language that they assume that the reader speaks. So the language used in a particular way which reveals the dialect of the people of a particular region, place, or area or time is which lends a quality of reality and authenticity to literature and any form that is poetry or novel. Now, apart from the deviation of dialect, which deals with the deviation in terms of the expression, there is another deviation that is more similar to the dialectical deviation that is referred to as the deviation of register. Now, it is important that you understand what is register or what's the difference between register and dialect. Now, dialect deals with the expression of language that belongs to a particular area or group or community, whereas register is more closely related to style. For example, if I say in explanation of the term register that I'm making use of academic register while I speak to you in this video or in this lecture. So this is academic register. I'm not making use of colloquial or informal register. I'm sticking to a formal academic register, and within that I'm making use of jargon or specialized language that deals with linguistics, literature, or more specifically stylistics. So this is how register is different from dialect. Dialect connects with region, place, and the register connects with situation, with the discipline, and with the sort of knowledge that is being communicated or sort of a discourse that is taking place. So it is not that borrowing language from other registers or non-poetic registers is new to English poetry and is being used in only the modern times. Though in the modern poetry we come across register borrowing as well as deviation of register more often than we used to in the old writings or the classical texts. So it is not borrowing language from other you can say non-poetic registers is a new invention, but poets of the present century, they rely more heavily, they exploit this device or deviation more than the ancient people or the classical people did. Modern poets have asserted their freedom from the constraints of the poetic language. So the poetic language which bound them to formal expression, formal diction, and the meter and rhyme has now been restricted only to you can say the expression of poetry. Now it has become a bit more flexible as the poetic language has expanded into conversational or colloquial modes as well. So when within a formal poem you come across certain words, vocabulary items, expressions and statements which seem quite you can say informal, colloquial, you call such exception as deviation of register. Register borrowing in poetry is almost always accompanied further incongruity of register mixing, and it is also the use of same text or features or characteristics of different register. Just as I explained to you that if you read a poem and you find in that poem a very rigid, meter, rule-bound, formal and stately language, and within that stately language there occur chunks of poetry or expression where the writer has shifted or drifted towards colloquial and informal expression, you will be surprised that how the more rigid, rule-bound and you can say stately expression has been challenged, converted, or changed by the inclusion or the infusion of colloquial language which does not match with the poetic standards or the standard poetic language. So that is how you will identify the deviation of register. Deviation of register, as it includes the mixing of registers of different kinds. For example, if a poet is making use of poetic register, and within that formal poetic register, he incorporates, for example, the mode or expression of a nursery rhyme, or the register of, for example, dialogue or conversation that would appear less formal and more colloquial, that would be termed as register deviation. There are many examples in the modern poetry which reflect that writers rely on this type of deviation to create foregrounding in their writing and to make some part or chunk of their poem more prominent and expressive. Observe this example of register deviation that is taken from Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. Eliot borrows the register from different domains. For example, the poem Wasteland has been written with a very formal and you can say standard poetic register or style. But within the poem, he makes use of sometimes colloquial register or the journalistic register or even the register from the nursery rhymes. Now, this example states that here poet has made use of the register of journalism. So in Eliot's Wasteland, we see the juxtaposition or the mingling of the high-flown language of poetry that is very, you can say, stately and serious and formal. And then apart from that, a few statements, sentences or lines would make us feel as if these are stock journalistic phrases or even very colloquial expressions too. This example, the nymphs have departed and the departed have left no address. This is the journalistic expression or phraseology because it is in the passive or it is in the form of the voice is passive. So departed have left no address and the nymphs have departed occurs at a point in the poem where the rest of the poem is being written in the active form or active voice or the speech. So if the poet deviates from the standard that he has been following in the previous lines, there we get to a shock or a hindrance or a surprise. We stop, we think, and we try to relate it that how this part or this expression is different from what has been expressed or presented earlier. Similarly, the deviation of register can be found in this chunk of the poem where I have taken a few lines for you to understand that how can you understand how the writers would mix two registers. Now this is a poem by Henry Reed. The poem's title is Naming of Parts. The poem Naming of Parts makes use of two very different types of register. Now let us observe the poem first and then figure out which two registers have been mixed or been used together. It states that today we have naming of parts, yesterday we had daily cleaning, and tomorrow morning we shall have what to do after firing. But today we have naming of parts. Japonica glistens like coral in all the neighboring gardens, and today we have naming of parts. Now this poem seems to be very much, you can say simple and like any nursery rhyme would be or children poems would be, because it doesn't represent any complicated expression or idea, as if naming of parts seems to be a game that is being played and the speaker is telling us in a very nonchalant or a simple manner the way the expressions in the nursery rhymes would be given utterances. Now the part that relates to register borrowing is that here the poet has borrowed registers from two various fields. One is the register of the expression of poetry, that is formal expression, and the other is the instruction manual that you come across. Here we see the effect of mingling of two registers of a different kind. For example, the training for the use of the rifles, that is the rifle instruction, and the lyrical poem. These two registers are mixed. The register of a lyrical poem and the register of rifle training, anything that would be instruction, are mixed together. So it is ironical in a bolder or more clear-cut manner, but nevertheless it is very effective that a poem sounds like an instruction manual that is given by an instructor or who is teaching or training people how to make use of the gun. The first 4 lines of the poem, as you can see, they apart from that last word japonica, they all seem to be taking verbatim from the rifle instructor's manual or his monologue, because he would be a single speaker dictating to the shooters or the learners how to control the rifle or manage the rifle. So they have a naively repetitive syntax, and it also seems a very inept and rigid or monotonous style of lecturing too, the way the poem expresses it as it is the manual of the instructor. And the mechanically produced regulation, army phrases which are being utilized over here in the poem are printed mostly like as a heading, or in the instruction it would be like capitalized naming of the parts, daily cleaning. Then the next step would be what to do after firing. So it would be just like a manual that you receive maybe with any electronic gadget that you buy for yourself. So now that manual, which has got a typical register that it would have instructions in the form of bullets or points or headings and steps, it seems to have been followed by the poet in the poem, which is mixing the lyrical poem register and the instruction manual register. So that is the example of register borrowing, the two different registers which belong to different set of instructions, training or expression have been mixed together. One is the register of a lyrical poem where the writer has been sticking to the rhyme. You can see that here, that yesterday, today, and the scheme which also seems to rhyme with the use of the repetition, that but today, and then repetition of the same word today in the very beginning. So all these expressions which are found in a lyrical poem are not strictly following the traditional lyrical mode of expression or writing. Rather, the writer who has got the title naming of the part for the sake of naming of the parts of the gun whose handling is being taught to some people who are of course the implied listeners, is being done as if it is instruction coming out of the tongue or the mouth of an instructor who is drilling the people, who is instructing the people, and who is completely non-conversant with the more formal use of language. Now, in the last line, the regulation language is yoked by coordination to the descriptive language that reveals the very irony when it reaches to its fullest concentration. That the last line of the lyric, today we have naming of parts. It is as if at the beginning of the lecture a person or teacher would say, today we would talk about deviation. So you do not really come across such descriptive expression in poetry. It shows that how prominent the register of an instructor, which you either come across in a manual or you come across while you are attending a class or an instruction guides, instruction guides class, there you encounter that. So here the poet has mingled or mixed the lyrical poems register with the register of instruction manual or person who is instructing the students or the learners. Now let us come to the last form or the type of deviation which we refer to as historical deviation. Now this is again another type of deviation which is used though rarely, but still it is regular in poetry and even other forms of literature too. Now historical deviation, as the very name suggests, would take us to the past. how would a deviation take us to the past? It's very simple for the writers to evoke the sense of belongingness or create a sense of belongingness in their writing with something that belongs to the past. So the historical deviation simply can be created in poetry or literature if the writers make use of such words, vocabulary and expressions which have now in the present time become archaic or obsolete, or they have been discarded. But if a writer who writes in the present time make use of such a diction or expression in the language which was popular or which was in vogue in the past, we would term that as the historical deviation or the use of historical deviation by the writer. So what a poet sees as his linguistic heritage may even include dead languages. For example, expression from Latin or Greek languages. If these expressions are given a new life or they have been reenacted or recreated for the sake of lending an air of charm or authenticity or even an antiquity, the sense of antiquity can also, or the sense of something that seems to belong to the past, if that is to be created in a poem, the writer would make use of historical deviation. For example, writers making use of such simple words like thou, thine in the contemporary poetry or language, they are considered to be making use of archaic words, because now we have got a replacement of these words in the form of you and yours. But when these words were popular in the Shakespearean age or in the classical age or in the age of Milton, there they did not seem archaic or obsolete. Now here in the present time, if these words like thou, thine, thy are used, they would be termed as obsolete or archaic words, and they would be termed as a use of historical deviation. So when a poet sees his linguistic heritage, even dead languages such as Latin or Greek, and he may include those items from Latin and Greek language within his text, and a type of historical license or violation is utilized by a writer, that if he belongs to a contemporary time or period, he makes use of a language or vocabulary or diction from the previous times. So a period of neoclassical culture may make use of some words which were popular in either the Renaissance age or the Anglo-Saxon age. So we seem to find a sort of reconstruction of language in this way as well. It's a matter of keeping the tradition alive, or the writer's connection with the traditions. So writers also, though they may be experimenting with the language to make it suit to the modern and contemporary standards, but as poetry is something that, or literature is something that does not really want to lose its connection with the past. So one way of getting connected to the past and to give a sense of antiquity and wonder to the reader is through the use of historical deviation. We find many examples of historical deviation in the writers such as Milton, or even the writers such as the famous writer Spencer, or even Shakespeare too, which make use of such deviant or historical deviant words. For example, in Milton's use that are being given for your understanding over here, Milton makes use of these words in his poems. For example, the word inspiring, which is used in the sense of breathing in. The expression or the action of inhaling is being referred to as inspiring. Now the word inspiring is not used in the modern sense, but within the poem Milton uses it to mean breathing. Induce, instead of what it means today or stands for as a meaning in contemporary time, he uses it to mention lead in. Whereas the word in which serpent error wandering, these lines are referred to as the verb, or as a substitute for the verb crawling and creeping. So these are the Latin derivations of the words which he has rendered in the English poetry for the sake of creating authenticity and antiquity or charm that would make them appear antique and historical. In the poetry of the Romantic poets also, like most importantly Shelley and also Coleridge, we encounter certain words which reveal the poet's longing or the poet's aspiration, that they take inspiration from the works of the past by evoking such images from language and such items of vocabulary in the contemporary poetry which they were writing in their time, that reflects the old age or the past times. In the language of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, a very famous poem, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, there is a certain amount of deliberate revival of obsolete usages. We encounter on every turn in Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner's reading that he makes use of words which have become obsolete in the Romantic age, but which were popular in the Classical age or in the age, or that is the Renaissance or the 16th century. We find historical coloring, and there is also some reliance upon standard archaic words which current poetry of today avoids. And that is why the beauty of the poetry is enhanced, because instead of sounding more modern or deviant from the standards of the classical time, the archaic words or the historical deviation makes poetry sound a bit old, traditional and antique. So it is said that the progression through time is cyclic, and that present and past are ultimately one. So that is the belief that operates behind the use of historical deviation. If a writer is making use of historical deviation, he is not really violating the standards of the present or the you can say the contemporary language or expression, either grammar or vocabulary, but he believes in the way that how language has evolved and how this language would be strengthened by certain ideas or comments or vocabulary items which have been present and popular in the past age. So these writers or poets who make use of historical deviation, they regard the progression of language, the evolution of language as a cyclic activity, and that they think that the present and past, if they are combined or united in the language, that would have a sense of belongingness and a sense of connection with the tradition. So the same idea that we talk about in literary criticism, that writers in the contemporary time wish to follow both the strands or streams. One is they want to invent something new, produce something on the basis of individual talent, which would add variety to the expression. On the other hand, the writers also wish to stick to those values which were popular in the past, that is, following the tradition. So historical deviation provides a writer very, you can say, significant or simpler a mode of making a connection with the past and making the text appear unique and embedded in the traditions of the past. Now, historical deviation is just like, with this analogy, you can understand that if you own a modern house, and that modern house, you have got everything that belonged to the contemporary time. It has got modern electronic gadgets, it has got certain comfortable items of furniture and furnishing, and very, contemporary design. But within that house that represents the modernity and your taste, that reveals that you are a contemporary and modern man, you also include or you also put certain items which are the artifacts of history, that is the antiques. Now those antiques would reveal your association with the past and your love for the past, as well as how you carry on the tradition along with the new ideas that you want to really implement in your life. So this is what historical deviation achieves. Just the way a piece of art in the form of an antique would represent your love for the past in your house, a historical deviation in poetry, which would occur in the form of an obsolete or an archaic word, which would open up a window into the past, that how these writers have transformed, evolved and changed language to suit to the modern needs of the readers, and then they still feel a sense of bonding and connection with the past traditions. So we had a look at the remaining four types of deviation. today, including the historical deviation, the deviation of register, and also the deviation of dialect. And in these deviations and semantic deviation, we found that how they create a text or a literary piece which would not seem to be simple or interpretable. Rather, it would complicate the reader's process of understanding, interpretation, and inference. And all these deviations operate on different levels. Some deviations operate at the level of the surface, changing the shape and form of poetry. Other deviations operate at the level of meaning, like semantic and morphological deviation, which change the meaning, message, and idea that is presented by the writer. So that is our study of the deviation, and we will in the next lecture move forward to another type of foregrounding which can be achieved through the use of parallelism. Thank you.